Next Chapter Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Michael Goodfriend, executive producer of the Play On podcast series. Normally, today would be the day we celebrate the conclusion of a series, in this case, 12th Night, with the release of the full play. While we are indeed doing so, it will only be available for Play On Premium subscribers. So, go to our website, playonpodcasts.com, and click the button to sign up for Play On Premium. You'll get exclusive bonus content interviews and roundtables with the cast and artists behind the scenes. Plus, for just $5 per month, that's almost the cost of a gallon of gas, you can enjoy an ad-free listening experience on all the full plays and individual episodes. And let me tell you, $5 for all of that content goes a lot further than a gallon of gas. Again, go to playonpodcasts.com, click Join Play On Podcasts Premium, and support the artists who worked so hard to bring you these reimagined Shakespeare plays in podcast form. We'll be back next week with the first episode of Henry V. I cannot wait for you to hear it. Now, shifting gears, I want to tell you about another show we are partnering with called The History of Literature. We're happy to share an episode of this thought-provoking podcast called In Shakespeare's Shadow with guest Michael Blanding. Give it a listen and subscribe to The History of Literature on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy.
Hello. It's been a mystery for centuries. How in the world did Shakespeare write what he wrote? Snobs have suggested that Shakespeare, the hick son of a Glover, couldn't possibly have possessed the intelligence and educational background to write the greatest works in the history of the English language, and these snobs, thankfully, have been mostly disproven. Genius could have found this boy and then man coming from Stratford. There's no requirement of an aristocratic lineage when it comes to dazzling intelligence and unparalleled insight into the human mind and heart. Nevertheless, the cloudy nature of Shakespeare's biography and the textual clues of Shakespeare's works have continued to raise questions. How the devil did he know what he knew, not just about love or friendship or power, but detailed knowledge about the law, or Italy, or history? Enter Dennis McCarthy, a rogue scholar armed with new tools for textual analysis and a freedom from the shackles of conventional wisdom. He develops a new theory. Shakespeare the Magpie had a source for many of his works, Sir Thomas North, who wrote some plays that have since been lost. And enter Michael Blanding, a journalist writing about McCarthy's efforts, who found himself sucked into the rabbit hole of theories and evidence. Why wouldn't academics take McCarthy's theory seriously? What more evidence did they require? And could Blanding, teaming up now with McCarthy, help to find it? A mystery about the mysteries of Shakespeare, pursued by a pair of detectives. We'll talk to one of those detectives, the unsuspecting journalist who dove into the fray like a Watson turning into a Holmes. Michael Blanding, today on The History of Literature. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the podcast. Oh, this is a fun one today. I'm doing a lot of nostalgic looking back these days. I'm not sure why that is, other than the podcast has a new producer. Congrats to us. This is definitely going to be an improvement over the old producer. I can already tell. Her name is Emma, and you can reach her at historyofliteraturepodcast@gmail.com. That's a new email address, by the way. Write to her with all your guest ideas, all you writers and publishers and press agents, public relations folks, especially those who are representing books about the history of literature, biographies, studies, and so forth. Maybe that's why I've been nostalgic. Welcome, Emma. Let me catch you up on what the show's all about, which has made me do some thinking. What is it about? 400 episodes in, we're still asking that question sometimes. 400 plus episodes. We were fueled by some heavy pandemic podcasting. My goodness, we spent a lot of time together in those months, didn't we? And I guess years. We made it through together. But looking back, it seems I have learned something about myself and my reading habits and my relationship with literature. There are two authors I always start to get a little twitchy about. Two writers who, if they're not on our list for a while and I haven't read them for a while, I start to get a little anxious. Time to check in. Time for me to touch base with them. They seem to be the two writers who mean the most to me these days. Maybe the two most indispensable. One of them is Chekhov, and the other is Shakespeare. That's not so wild, is it? I don't think that would come as a shock to anyone. It's not like they've been hiding somewhere in the shadows. They're two giants. It's like saying there are two elements I like best, oxygen and carbon or something. There are lots to pick from. You might like hydrogen and helium and, I don't know, gold. Nothing against any of those. Lithium, nitrogen. Got nothing against nitrogen. I just realized, I just realized my two are killing the planet in the wrong combination. But they are also the source of life in the right combination. Where am I going with this? Should have said colors. There are lots of colors out there. If I say my two favorites are blue and red, it's not going to stop any presses, is it? It's not like periwinkle and chartreuse. In any case, it's been a while since we've had a Shakespeare show, and so I was glad to have the chance to talk to Michael Blanding, who has been on a pursuit, which he will tell us all about. I have an uneasy relationship with Shakespeare authorship questions, mostly because they can come from an unfortunate place. But this inquiry is different. And anyway, we get into all this with Michael, so why don't we just bring him out? His book was originally called North by Shakespeare. I think the pronunciation of that actually should be a little different, right? The title, North by Shakespeare, it comes because the book is about Sir Thomas North and that theory that I alluded to at the beginning, and we'll hear more about soon from Michael. But I think the title was also intended to be a play on North by Northwest, right? The spy and the intrigue and the chase. Don't you think? It has to be. Shakespeare wasn't writing a book called North. It's a play on words. So we'd pronounce that book North by Shakespeare, right? North by Northwest, North by Shakespeare. I don't know. Nobody asked me to do that. I'm coming up with all this on my own. A little detective work of my own. A little induction. Now they've changed the title for the paperback, ending the dilemma for podcast hosts everywhere. North by Shakespeare or North by Shakespeare? We were suffering, people. But now the book is called In Shakespeare's Shadow, which is also a good title. Michael Blanding and his search through the Shakespearean shadows after this. Okay, joining me now is Michael Blanding, an investigative journalist and the author of In Shakespeare's Shadow, which tells the story of a rogue scholar named Dennis McCarthy, who may have discovered an undiscovered source for Shakespeare's plays. Michael Blanding, welcome to the History of Literature.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Michael, let's start with your origin story on this project anyway. What drew you to the story of Dennis McCarthy?
Yeah, so as you said in the intro, I'm an investigative reporter. I have written for magazines, and I've written a couple of books on a wide variety of topics. I'm by no means a Shakespeare scholar, but I'm always interested in stories that have compelling characters and particularly stories that can teach us something or explain something that we didn't understand before. And Dennis approached me after a book talk that I gave for my previous book, The Map Thief. And he introduced himself as a scholar of geography. He'd written this book about biogeography and how plants and animal species move around the world. And so, as a map lover, I was very intrigued by that. And we went out for drinks with him and his daughter, and had a great conversation about maps and geography. And then about 2 drinks in, he sort of leans across the table and says, "By the way, I have this new theory about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare wrote his plays, and I'd love for you to write about it." And, as a reporter, I sort of rolled my eyes and said, "Oh, no, here we go. This is some, lunatic theory about Shakespeare not being Shakespeare." And I started kind of looking for the exits. But a lot of what he said just made a lot of sense. And afterwards, he followed up and he sent me some of the things he'd written. And I just started getting excited about it. It really stoked my curiosity. And as a reporter, that's always a good thing when you start getting curious. And from there, we just started talking more and more. And it eventually culminated in this book.
Yeah. Okay. So you did not come into this with a position on Shakespeare's authorship. You weren't. And if anything, you were a little bit dubious about some of the claims that Shakespeare didn't actually write the plays.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I hadn't really looked into it very much, but, certainly I'd studied Shakespeare in college as a literature major, and I'd seen Shakespeare's plays. I was a Shakespeare lover, and I just sort of always assumed that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, and all of these other theories about, some other writer like the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon were just, just somebody sort of creating this fiction, and I'd never really examined it that much and seen a lot of the reasons why people have come up with those theories and a lot of the mysteries that are at the heart of a lot of Shakespeare's plays.
Now, my understanding of Dennis McCarthy is that originally he was one of the individuals who was using plagiarism software and had kind of applying some technology to the question and had found some links and so on that way. Is that kind of where he was when you met him?
Yeah, so he's an interesting character and was a really fun character to follow for my book and to write about. As I said, he was a scholar of geography, but he never really went to graduate school or got an advanced degree or anything. He was sort of this kind of polymath, sort of self-taught scholar. But he published this book with Oxford University Press and published some peer-reviewed articles on the subject of biogeography and evolution. And then about 15 years ago, he just started kind of as a side project looking at Shakespeare and saying, wondering if he could sort of trace the origins of Shakespeare's plays the way you might trace like the origins of a species and how they evolved. He wanted to see sort of how Shakespeare's plays evolved. And one of the tools that he used was plagiarism software to sort of take the work of Shakespeare and take the work of other authors and see what kind of textual fingerprints there were between the two. And when he did that, he came across this author by the name of Sir Thomas North. And when he ran when he ran a test with all of Shakespeare's plays and all of Thomas North's writings, he just got hit after hit after hit. All of these phrases in common and all of these stories and ideas, and in some cases, stories and phrases that were used nowhere else in English, and that seemed to be connected between Shakespeare and this other author, Thomas North, and just play after play after play. And that's what sort of set him down this obsession that he's had for over 15 years now of looking into the connections between Shakespeare and Thomas North.
Right. So this is, I'm fascinated by this question. I'm less interested in some of the Shakespeare authorship theories kind of depend on, counting the letters in words and almost like a numerology or, sort of the first word in or the first letter of the sixth word. And
right. Of course, you can always find what you want to find if you just use the right combination of words and letters.
Right. And there is I would say kind of an unpalatable side to some of the conspiracy theories, which is that Shakespeare, someone educated in Stratford, could not have been this genius, and and kind of there's sort of a snobbery built into it for some of the people who kind of came at it with that as their agenda. But if I'm understanding McCarthy's position, it's more like the one that, frankly, I like, which is, Shakespeare wrote the plays, but he was a magpie like all artists are. He gathered what he needed, and let's see if we can find exactly what he was pulling from and what he was borrowing and what he was stealing and what he was inspired by and so on in order to actually write the plays. Is that a fair characterization of where McCarthy is?
Yeah, so it's a lot closer to that. It's not saying, as you mentioned, that someone else sort of secretly wrote the plays, and Shakespeare was sort of a front man for some noble or something who couldn't write the plays publicly. McCarthy does believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, that all the plays that have his name on it were actually written by William of Stratford of Avon. So I want to get that out of the way right there, that this is not a conspiracy theory per se. There's no sort of conspiracy needed to understand it. But what does make it controversial is that we know that Shakespeare not only used these prose sources like Holinshed's Chronicles or Norse Plutarch's Lives, but he also adapted older plays. And, even mainstream scholars agree that he often took these old plays and rewrote them and adapted them for the public stage. But for some reason, they've been really curiously uninterested in trying to figure out who actually wrote those plays. They have just assumed that they were inferior, that they were old plays that, some inferior writer wrote years ago, and Shakespeare kind of took them and gussied them up, and, he was the real genius. And what McCarthy says is that, no, actually, most of these plays that we now think of as Shakespeare were based on these older plays written by Thomas North. And so it does actually, it's more than just saying, Shakespeare was sort of taking these prose sources and crafted them into plays. It's saying that he actually was adapting these plays, but he may have sort of taken these older plays and added sort of his own unique brilliance. And it's more of a collaboration between Shakespeare and North than it is, a straight borrowing.
Right. Okay. So let's save Thomas North for now. Although I was especially interested to see that he was the translator of Plutarch's Lives, which I've always associated as being with Shakespeare as being one of Shakespeare's strongest sources. But let's do this. McCarthy's work is said to answer many lingering questions about the bard, and what are those questions, and why is this something that we're trying to unpack? What is it about Shakespeare's plays and Shakespeare the person that I have a handful that I have in mind, but I'm wondering how you would answer that.
Well, I had never really looked into it that much. Like I say, I'd never really explored Shakespeare as an author before. But when you start looking into it and you start reading biographies of Shakespeare, they're incredibly thin. We know almost nothing about Shakespeare aside from just a few basic sort of biographical facts.
Yeah, and there's big gaps, like what was he doing for this 10-year stretch? And so
right. So there's all of these sort of periods, they call them the lost years. And, all we know is that he grew up in Stratford. He probably didn't go to university. At some point, he ended up in London. He married. He left his wife in Stratford, came to London, and then was a sharer in the Lord Chamberlain's Men and has his name on a dozen or so plays that were published in his lifetime. And outside of that, there's just very little that's known about Shakespeare. And then when you look at the plays and think about what would be required to write the plays, yes, there's sort of an education aspect to it that, they draw on a huge variety of sources. And so that is, pretty remarkable for someone who grew up the son of a glove maker in Stratford, but not impossible. But what's really striking is just the experiences that are illustrated in the plays of these travels to Italy, of fighting as a soldier in war, of going to, court and being, involved at sort of the highest levels of society. And those are the things that, are very hard to fake and very hard for someone who hasn't had those kind of experiences to write about. And so there's all these theories that, oh, maybe Shakespeare just spent a lot of time in the tavern and talked to travelers who came from Italy, and that's why he has all these, very specific details of particular places that he never visited, or maybe during those lost years, he took a trip there himself, or things like that. That scholars have sort of tried in many ways to kind of contort themselves to try to come up with an explanation for this. But it's, part of the mystery that has spurred all of these theories about, well, maybe it wasn't Shakespeare. Maybe it was someone else who actually was a gentleman or a noble and did have these travels and did have these foreign experiences, who actually wrote the plays.
Yeah. And one I'll add to that is this specialized knowledge in the law, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you may think that, oh, this was something that was, just prevalent in society, but, it's not like they had Wikipedia and Google back then. Many of the plays have these very complex legal terms, or these very particular terms of soldiery or falconry, or, all of these kind of aspects that you really get from learned experience. And, it's very hard to come up with an explanation for how Shakespeare could have had all of this, very specialized knowledge.
Right. Okay. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and learn about Sir Thomas North and see how he might be someone who could fit into this puzzle, so to speak. Okay, we are back. Michael Blanding, what do we know about Thomas North?
So Thomas North is a fascinating figure. He is best known, as you mentioned before, as the author, or the translator, rather, of this book, Plutarch's Lives. And it is a group of biographies of Greek and Roman figures. And we know that is what Shakespeare used for his Roman plays, for Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra and Coriolanus. They all come from stories from Plutarch's Lives. But outside of that, not only did he write several other translations, but he led this really colorful life as a soldier in the Netherlands and Ireland, as a diplomat to France and Italy, and as somebody who was, the son of a lord who sort of never quite lived up to his father's potential. He ended up sort of impoverished at the end of his life, and so had sort of experiences of these extreme highs of these travels and these battles and very exciting incidents, and these extreme lows of sort of living in poverty and never quite getting the recognition he deserved. And so you just look at all these aspects of his biography, and you just start checking one after one all of these experiences that really could lend themselves to that kind of depth of feeling and that kind of variety of experiences that you find in these great works of literature that we know as Shakespeare's plays.
Yeah, and I understand there's a journal, for example, that shows North's travels through France and Italy, and there are some links with that in some of Shakespeare's writings. Is that something that McCarthy found, or was that something that he found the significance of?
He basically discovered it. It was in the there are a couple of copies of it. There's one in the British Library, and there's one in the Lambeth Palace Library in London. And there's just one of the copies has been attributed to Thomas North, but nobody ever really read it. And so after McCarthy used the plagiarism software and started finding all these textual links, he started looking into the life of Thomas North. And so this journal was one of the things that he looked at. And this was sort of a travelogue that North had written on the way to Italy. He was on this delegation to Rome in 1555 when he was very young. And it was a journey to reconcile Queen Mary with the Pope. So her father, Henry VIII, had sort of famously split with the Catholic Church. And so she sent these delegates to try to, make nice with the Pope and make England Catholic again. And so on these travels, North wrote, just incredible details about all of the experiences and all these sights and sounds and people that he met along the way. And one of them is this church in Italy that is full of these lifelike wax statues. And that same day, he also went to this palace and he saw these beautiful frescoes by the artist Giulio Romano. And why that's significant is because Giulio Romano is the only Renaissance artist that's actually mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. And he's mentioned at the end of The Winter's Tale when there is this beautiful lifelike wax statue that comes alive. And one of the characters in the play says that it was created by Julia Romano. And in the context of the play, that statue coming alive has actually been interpreted as it's this very sort of religious experience of sort of that's been associated with the Virgin Mary, and some scholars have even associated it with Queen Mary and sort of the return of Catholicism that was sort of sleeping, and then kind of awakes after many years, and so which was of course the exact mission that Thomas North was on for that delegation. And so, you look at an example like that, and it just seems, really uncanny that there would be all of these coincidences and in this handwritten journal that Shakespeare or anyone else wouldn't have had access to that, we only have today because it's, turned up in the library. But, and that's just one example of ways that Thomas North's life has sort of figured into the plays and been interpreted in really interesting ways.
Right. So is the theory that Shakespeare somehow got access to this journal or knew someone who knew Thomas North, or that North had written some plays that Shakespeare had either seen or had access to a written version of it and was maybe plays that no longer exist?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the theory that Dennis has proposed is that Thomas North actually used his experiences to write a play that was sort of an early version of The Winter's Tale, and probably wrote it close to the time of that delegation in the 1550s. And then when Queen Elizabeth took the throne and was a Protestant, you couldn't really have kind of an overtly Catholic play. And so, he put it in a drawer somewhere, and then years later, either sold it to Shakespeare or Shakespeare sort of otherwise acquired it through, one of the theater companies of the day, and then turned that into The Winter's Tale, which was produced in 1611. And, there's other examples, too, of these manuscripts and books that were in the North family library that, again, Shakespeare wouldn't have had access to. And so, either he was using everything Thomas North wrote, including his private papers, or Dennis is really onto something, and North wrote early versions of these plays that then Shakespeare adopted.
Well, that seems like, given that he was in the theater and there were theater companies, it doesn't seem outrageous to me to think that there would have been a trunk full of old plays and things. This would have been decades before Shakespeare was writing, right?
That's right. Yeah. And some of these plays scholars have even identified. So if you look at, the introductions to Shakespeare plays, there's all these references of an early version of Hamlet, an early version of Romeo and Juliet, an early version of The Merchant of Venice. And they just sort of pass it off as, oh, yes, this was something that was mentioned in the rebels' records or mentioned in some noble's diary or something. But when you start looking at it and you start matching up the dates, they really match the experiences that Thomas North had and the time in which he would have been writing. And, it provides, to my mind, a really sensible explanation for, how a lot of these details got into the plays at the same time, allowing for Shakespeare's authorship and maybe even substantial rewriting and genius. And, that it doesn't rely on any sort of secret cabal of writers that were trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes.
Yeah. And, that is always, maybe this is why I wound up doing a podcast called The History of Literature. But that is always one of my favorite parts of those editions of Shakespeare, when they have those sources, because I think some people think that it kind of dilutes Shakespeare and his power to think that he was borrowing from predecessors like that. But I actually find it just endlessly fascinating to be looking at the sources and then seeing the changes he made and seeing what he did with it. Often it's almost like Francis Ford Coppola taking The Godfather as sort of a hack novel and turning it into a brilliant film, and just looking at the changes that you would make to a character or a plot point or layering it with language. Now, I guess we wouldn't know for sure how much of Shakespeare's language was his own. And how much he had lifted. It's a possibility that he might have lifted, soliloquies or other things. Although I think there's probably enough evidence that Shakespeare was a gifted enough writer that we probably feel comfortable that he would have been capable of writing what he wrote.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I agree. I think it makes it a much more interesting and much more fascinating story to kind of look through this lens. And even mainstream scholars have been increasingly looking at Shakespeare as being a more collaborative writer and looking at the hand of Christopher Marlowe or Thomas Nash or these other playwrights of the period and finding their hand in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. And it just kind of makes sense to me, like when you look at, for example, the movies or TV shows that we watch today, they're all these kind of collaborative enterprises between a director, a writer, the actors, maybe there's some ad-libbing that happens on set. And the more you look into playwriting of the Elizabethan period, that same kind of thing was going on, where they would have, these rewrites when they would take a show on the road and an actor would drop out. And there's all these early versions of Shakespeare's plays and the quarto editions. And they were these kind of living, breathing works of art that were constantly being changed and adapted, and not what we think of them today as like, the complete works of William Shakespeare, and we're very precious about every word. And so when I started learning about this and I started, digging really deep into even the mainstream scholarship on this issue, it really seemed to make a lot of sense and really excited me to think about, how all these different hands were maybe contributing to these plays and making them these masterpieces that we still read 400 years later.
Yeah. And Shakespeare was getting demands from his audience, right? They were saying like, why don't you retell this one? Or why don't you, we want to have this character back, or we want to see you do this. And it's almost like you can imagine it being in a Hollywood producer's office where people are coming in and saying, I'm gonna write Die Hard on a ship, or I'm gonna, this will be a Cinderella story, but it'll be set in the, on the Upper West Side or something. So I think, or I guess I should have said Romeo and Juliet would have been
right.
The Upper West Side would have been even better. So you mentioned mainstream scholars a couple of times. Yes. And my understanding is that McCarthy has not always been treated favorably by academics. Is it because he's an outsider who's trespassing on their turf, or is it something about his methods, or is it the conclusions he's reached? How exactly has he been treated, and what do you think is behind it?
Yeah, that's something that I really explore in the book. As a journalist, I went into, obviously tell McCarthy's story and talk about his theories and investigate them myself. But I was just as fascinated with looking at how McCarthy has been received in his theories and kind of more broadly on how knowledge gets created and changed, and, what it takes for somebody to kind of buy into a new theory about a particular topic. And, what's really fascinating to me is that McCarthy hasn't been completely disregarded by academia. He's been really celebrated sometimes when he comes out with a particular article that's published in a journal, or he wrote a book about a manuscript that was in the North Family Library as a source for Shakespeare, and he got all kinds of acclaim from scholars and saying, it's amazing, you discovered this new source for Shakespeare that no one knew about. And so that's all well and good. But then when he sort of tells his larger theory and says, almost all of Shakespeare's plays are based on the work of this other writer, Thomas North, he is, looked at as this heretic and either completely ignored or completely attacked by people. And that was really fascinating to me to say, on the one hand, how can you sort of support these pieces of the theory and yet not even be willing to consider the larger aspect of the theory? And I think there's some, I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think that part of it is feeling like this outsider is sort of, impinging on their turf, and who is he to, come and, he doesn't have a PhD from Columbia, who's he to tell them, or let alone Oxford or something. And, he's an American without a degree, how has he sort of discovered this Shakespeare secret that everyone missed? And so there's, interestingly, you mentioned the snobbery of the anti-Shakespeareans, anti-Stratfordians. I think there's a bit of snobbery on the Stratfordian side as well. But I also sort of have some sympathy for it because, I think about sort of a scholar who's lived their whole life with a particular version of Shakespeare, and it's been passed down from generations, and very diligent scholars putting together these pieces of this puzzle, maybe on one particular play or one particular aspect of the plays, and then you have this sort of brash young scholar who comes in and says, actually everything you thought you knew about Shakespeare is if not wrong, then at least not quite how you thought it was. And so I understand that resistance, and I understand that skepticism, and I think that it takes a very open-minded and very kind of strong and confident person to kind of overcome their own, deeply seated ideas to really consider something new, and it's not easy, and I don't take that lightly.
Yeah, and in fairness to them, they may have had stretches where they had to, debate whether Christopher Marlowe had written it or whether Sir Francis Bacon had written it, and they probably are a little bit. There's probably some scar tissue there of, boy, this is yet another assault on the idea, and haven't we gone through this over and over and over, and this never really pans out the way that the advocates argue for, and so on. But
it's very true.
But on the other hand, it is an interesting question of, well, what evidence do you accept, and how much do you, what is it that allows you to consider another source as being at least somehow inspirational or influential, or, to be part of this, our understanding of this work? And when do you just draw the line and say, no, that's too speculative?
Yeah. And I should say that there is one scholar who has actually become completely converted to McCarthy's ideas, and I profile her in the book as well. She is a woman by the name of June Schluter, and she's a professor emerita at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. And she is really sort of an interesting foil to Dennis. He's very kind of brash and excitable, and she's very sober and got this, wickedly dry sense of humor. And the two of them together, Dennis could not have gone as far as he has without her, because she's really taken a lot of his kind of exuberance and really crafted it into, more academic arguments, and they published books and papers together. And in some ways, she's just as fascinating as Dennis, if not more so, because she's someone who was in the Shakespeare world and really deeply immersed in the particular version of William of Stratford that's sort of standard in academia. And yet, for some reason, she was able to really look at it with fresh eyes and show this curiosity and give Dennis, not immediately, but over time, give him a hearing, and was gradually convinced by the evidence to the point where she's now actually doing scholarship with him and uncovering things that he hasn't even found. So there's sort of this odd couple sort of buddy comedy aspect of the book, too, of, looking at these two people from different worlds that have sort of made common cause to try to, tilt against the windmills of academia.
So what is the evidence that North wrote plays? Are there any productions of plays that we have records of, or does anybody talk about them? Or apart from just the textual analysis and matching things up from his journals and seeing them repeated in Shakespeare's plays, do we know of any productions or any actors or anyone who mentions Thomas North?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and it's one of the areas that I think is most difficult for people to swallow and say, okay, maybe Thomas North really used a lot of time. Maybe Shakespeare used a lot of Thomas North's writings, but, where are these plays that you're saying that Shakespeare adapted? And the simple answer is that almost no plays from the Elizabethan period have survived in manuscript, including Shakespeare's plays. We have one fragment of a play that may be Shakespeare's in manuscript, but even that is controversial. So these things just were not kept unless they were actually published. They were not. They didn't stand the test of time, and I think only 10% of the plays written in the period have survived, even in publication. So there's that, but there's also there are these references that seem to point to North as the author of plays, and Dennis has spent years sort of looking at these kind of either satirical pamphlets or other plays that sort of, mention North in sort of coded language. And this is where it starts, getting a little bit like what we were talking about before with like the codes and the ciphers. But instead of sort of like looking at, numerology, it sort of looks at these references. Like someone will talk about, the north wind, or we'll talk about, mention, sort of the work that Thomas North write, and then in the next sentence, mention something that looks like one of Shakespeare's plays. And it was the way that a lot of the writers at the time sort of wrote about each other, because as a gentleman, Thomas North wouldn't have really been sort of allowed to write plays. It wasn't sort of something that was kind of done in polite society. So you sort of had these other writers that were sort of poking fun of him through these pamphlets and other plays. But there are also some references, like to payments to Thomas North for in the amounts that would have been paid for a play, and it's right next to the payments for players. And there's other references from writers that sort of praise North's writing, and not just his translation, but sort of his originality and his writing. And so there are a lot of these references that McCarthy has been able to kind of drum up to support this theory, but there's no kind of smoking gun. There's no letter or something that says, I really enjoyed Thomas North's play last night. And that's something that if he were to find it, it would add a lot more credence, and I think really add to the acceptance of his theory. But so far that has eluded him.
This is a totally off the wall analogy, but I'm sort of reminded of Barack Obama, the story where he was teaching as a professor of law, and he would read these speeches, and then he said, nobody talks like this anymore, and nobody uses rhetoric like this anymore, like these politicians did, Robert Kennedy and people like that, and then he kind of, he made his name with that famous speech at the convention. And I'm almost imagining Shakespeare taking a look at Thomas North's plays and saying, God, these were really good. That like everyone's forgotten about this guy, but there's a lot here. There's a lot here that we could still use today. And this, this shouldn't have faded the way that it did, or this never really, took off. But I think the audience would really appreciate it now, or something like that. It's possible that could have happened.
Yeah, well, some of Shakespeare's plays are really kind of looked at as throwbacks to older types of writing. Like, for example, there's this genre of writing called Senecan tragedy, which was this kind of these very emotional tragedies where everyone dies at the end, and they were kind of based on the work of the Roman writer Seneca, and it was really popular in the 1550s and 1560s. And people look at Hamlet now as sort of a kind of neo-Senecan tragedy that was written much later, and even at the time, people sort of made fun of it and said, "Oh, here's another Senecan tragedy. Aren't we over? Are we over that by now?" So there is something to what you're saying, that it could have been that North wrote this Senecan tragedy based on this tale of this Norse prince, back in the day when that form was popular. And then, years later, Shakespeare took it and converted it into this play that we all read today as sort of the pinnacle of literature.
Yeah. Okay. So I've also come to understand that you did not just limit yourself to interviewing Dennis McCarthy and writing about things from his perspective, but you actually dove into the archives yourself and started looking for things. And what documents, or I guess works, I should say, were you looking for, and what did you find, and what happened to you as part of this story?
Yeah, I sort of underwent my own journey through the writing of this. And, I really approached it as an investigative reporter. I said, I'm going to, be skeptical. I'm going to talk to people on all sides of the issue. I'm going to give Dennis a hearing, but I'm not going to sort of take his word for it. I'm going to do my own research too. And so I actually went to the archives, to the National Archives in London and the British Library and the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and spent hours and hours looking for letters and documents and books myself. And one of the things that I found was Dennis had actually known about this, but he'd never really looked at it. It was a copy of one of Thomas North's early books called The Dial of Princes. It was his first translation. And this was a copy that was actually owned by him, and that he'd actually written voluminously in the margins. And I started reading it. And as I said, Dennis hadn't even looked at this yet. And I started seeing all of these references that seemed to call to mind Macbeth for me. And the marginalia was written in 1591, and I'd never even talked to Dennis about Macbeth. I didn't even know his theories about it, but I started showing this to him, and he had sort of independently already determined that North had written his version of Macbeth in 1592, and so that sort of matched up. And then I started looking for more books from the North Family Library, and I found several others that actually had Thomas North's marginalia in it, including one that seemed to almost write out the complete plot to Cymbeline, which was a play that was that, for as far as we know, Shakespeare didn't even write until after North died. And so I started just finding all of these really uncanny, quote unquote coincidences of, North's own handwriting in these books that, were uncannily similar to Shakespeare's plays. And so it became harder and harder for me to maintain my own kind of neutrality on the issue, as I was sort of finding this evidence myself that Dennis didn't even know about. And, I had to admit to a certain point that I was believing in this theory myself, and that I was no longer just acting as a journalist, sort of as a kind of impartial observer, but that actually I was now part of the story and was collaborating on this research myself. And that was a really interesting journey for me as somebody who has been trained as a journalist, and yet at the same time I need to be honest with the reader about how I was finding merit in this theory and really thinking that there was something to it.
And I understand that there are some possibilities waiting for us in the Folger Shakespeare Library. What do you think might be there?
Yeah, so I have actually continued. My book was published in hardcover last year. It just came out in paperback as in Shakespeare's Shadow, and yet I have continued to do work on this story and continued to investigate along with Dennis and look for more of these books from the North Family Library. And as I say, I found about a half dozen of them so far with North's handwriting in them. But the treasure trove of books from the North Family Library, actually at the Folger, are at least 40 books there that we know just from the card catalog that were previously owned by the Norths, and some of them have marginalia in them. Unfortunately, the Folger is closed for renovations and has been for the past year and a half, and is not going to reopen until next year. And so I'm dying to get in there, and I'm dying to look at these books and see if there might be any more clues there. But unfortunately, we're just going to have to wait.
Well, and it's one thing to think you might be finding a handful of clues, but you could find a smoking gun.
Right. And that's the thing that, would really lend credence to this theory and really, I think, take it out of the realms of speculation and start having it seriously considered. I think that between Dennis and June Schluter and myself, we found a lot of intriguing evidence that all kind of points in the same direction. But boy, it would be really great to have that one piece of marginalia that's uncontrovertibly, a line from Hamlet or something, or something in another letter from someone else referring to Thomas North in reference to one of the plays. I think that would really be the thing that would really need to happen to kind of take this more into the mainstream. And
I didn't realize that he lived as long as he did. I mean, it's possible he could comment on Shakespeare. I suppose that might have been noticed before, but you could have Thomas North saying, that guy stole yet another thing from me.
Well, he actually lived until 1604, and Shakespeare, that was the heart of Shakespeare's career there. And one of the pieces of evidence that Dennis has looked at is actually this satire called Green's Groatswort of Wit. It's got this kind of strange name, but it is sort of famous for actually referring to Shakespeare as, this upstart crow in the shake scene,
right?
Sort of famously. But if you read the rest of that satire, it also talks about this sort of courtly writer who was selling plays to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was adapting them and producing them as his own. And so, it's very possible that North actually knew Shakespeare and approved of this, and was, as I say, he was in poverty at the time, could have been selling these old plays to Shakespeare and, seeing them produced under Shakespeare's name and been, completely okay with the arrangement.
Yeah. It seems almost ridiculous to us now to think, well, why would Thomas North, why wouldn't he want credit for being Shakespeare? Right. But at the time, it's not as if anyone foresaw that 400 years later we would view Shakespeare as the genius of all geniuses. And, It could be that he was just kind of like, oh, yeah, here's a way for me to make some cash. Kind of like someone might go, help ghostwrite a screenplay or do some work, write a song for Whitney Houston or someone and and just view it as, well, this is just how things have worked out for me. No one's producing my plays. And so I can do it through this guy. And that's kind of interesting. I make a little money and that's fine.
No, that's right. That's exactly sort of how things were back then. That this whole idea of copyright didn't really exist, and plays were just looked at as this sort of ephemeral thing that were mostly just produced on stage and weren't really, sometimes they were published during a plague year or something for the company to make a little extra money, but they weren't really looked at as these great works of art that we look at them today. Most of them were published anonymously until the 1590s, and Thomas North could very well have looked at his prose translations as, Plutarch's Lives as sort of the great work of his life, and not, really thought much about the plays or not really thought about getting credit for them. As a gentleman, he wouldn't really want to be associated with the public stage and, all the rabble and kind of, exuberance of the stage and people throwing vegetables and all of that and just been very happy to sell these plays to Shakespeare that he could then adapt them and kind of make them into these kind of crowd pleasing dramas.
Okay, well, I think now, knowing the listeners to this podcast as I do, as I have come to learn about them these last several years, I think they will be very eager to read your book, In Shakespeare's Shadow. Michael Blanding, thank you so much for joining me on the History of Literature.
Oh, thanks for the great conversation. It's been really fun.
Okay, there we go. My thanks to Michael Blanding for joining me. Please do check out his fascinating book, In Shakespeare's Shadow. And my thanks to Will Shakespeare. I'm familiar enough with him to call him Will, right? Billy Shakespeare, my old pal, and Tommy North, my new one. My thanks to them. What am I talking about here? I'm Jacke. What's on the calendar? Ulysses coming up, Hemingway, Dr. Seuss, Elizabeth Bishop, lots of good stuff. Please do subscribe and tell all your friends. I'm Jacke Wilson. No, don't tell your friends. I'm Jacke Wilson. Tell all your friends, brackets, about the show. Close brackets, period. New paragraph, pause, heavy inhalation. I'm Jacke Wilson. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Next Chapter Podcasts.